Welcome to episode 4 of my Louboutin Legit Check guide. In this final episode, we're going to start off by busting some of the biggest legit check shopping myths that can trick you into buying a fake. Then I'm going to share with you some of my best tips for shopping safely on the Preloved marketplace. And finally, I'm going to share with you the story of how I got tricked into buying a pair of fakes and explain all of the red flags that I missed. So if you're ready to graduate the course, let's get started. All right, let's bust some common myths. Myth number 1, half sizes can't be faked. This is 100% not true. I don't know how this myth got started, but in fact, the fakes that I purchased were 37.5, so half sizes can definitely be faked. Now, it is definitely true that I see more full sizes that are fake than half sizes, but I've seen at least 50 fakes that are half sizes in the past year, so it definitely happens. And this is actually true for not only pumps, but I've even seen sneakers and other styles of Louboutins that are faked that are half sizes. Myth number 2 is that the red bottoms on fakes can't be leather. More often than not, I would say 90% of the time, they're plastic or some sort of material that's not leather, but I have seen fakes that were actually leather. In fact, the ones that I purchased were leather. Now, they had been resold on the bottoms, but this part was actually leather, and you could tell it was leather. So long story short is if you are looking at a pair of shoes and you can tell that the red bottoms are real leather, that's a great sign, highly likely that they're real, but you're still going to want to run through the checklist and look at all the other indicators before you determine whether or not they are real, because it's still possible that they could be fake. The third myth is that fakes are priced really low, to the point where you almost suspect them because of the price. This is 100% not true. 90% of the fakes that I've seen are priced as if they were real. Most are priced between $400 and $700. So you definitely cannot look at the price to judge whether or not the shoe is fake. In contrast, myth number 4 is that real Louboutins are always priced high. More often than not, they are priced appropriately for that shoe, but I've actually seen some Louboutins that are priced extremely low to the point where you're like, are these fake? There's no way that the seller is willing to get rid of this shoe for that price. For example, I bought a pair of Hot Chick 130s for $200. They're a very rare shoe, and the fact that a seller was willing to get rid of it for $200 seems insane. In this case, it was a guy trying to sell them for a friend who didn't really care. And the guy didn't know anything about Louboutins. He actually mislabeled them as a Hot Chick 100 and not a 130. 130s are a lot more expensive than 100s. So he just didn't know what he had, and he honestly didn't care. He was just trying to get rid of them. So that does happen. Occasionally, you can get a great deal on a pair of Louboutins from a seller that just is trying to get rid of them. Myth number 5 is that sellers who have sold fakes in the past have negative feedback. This is not true. I look for fakes in the Preloved marketplace almost every single day. And if I'm being honest, I still have not found a single seller that is selling fakes and also had negative feedback, identifying them as someone who sold fakes. So keep that in mind. You would think logically that if someone bought a fake, that they would right away automatically go write negative feedback for that seller. But what if you're stuck in a situation where you're still trying to get your money back? That's what happened to me. I hate to admit that I didn't leave negative feedback for the seller that sold me fakes. When I got them and I realized they were fake, it was a nightmare trying to get my money back. At first, the seller was sticking to the lie that they were real, and so it was a back and forth between eBay and me and the seller. Then when they finally accepted the return, I, of course, wanted to wait until they received the return and I got my money back before I left feedback, because I didn't want anything to risk me getting my money back. 2 days before the shoes were scheduled to be delivered to the seller, they went in and tried to put a hold on my return, claiming that they hadn't received them yet and they're not gonna, give me my money back, basically trying to accuse me of scamming them. Fortunately, I had a lot of proof that I had shipped the shoes. Not only did I have the tracking information that showed that the shoes were going to be delivered in a couple of days, but I had photo and video evidence of me packing up the shoes and taking them to the post office. But even with all of that evidence, I had to wait weeks before eBay would lift the hold. So by the time all of this is said and done, the window had passed for me to leave feedback. I fully believe that this was the seller's plan. I'm sure they've done this before. It was so calculated, the timing that everything happened. It was kind of ironic. If you as a buyer did not take photos and have evidence that you mailed these shoes back, that seller would get to keep your money and the shoes. If that didn't work, like in my case, and they still had to give me the money back, it still worked in their favor because it made the process so drawn out where I couldn't leave negative feedback without risking the seller doing something else and then me having a harder time getting my money back. So just remember that story. It happens all the time. For you as a buyer, if you do buy fakes, definitely take video, photos, everything, proof that you ship them back. But I'm not the only person this has happened to. I guarantee this has happened to a lot of people. So a lot of times you're not going to see negative feedback on that seller because of all those things. The last myth is that Preloved marketplace apps such as eBay and Poshmark will remove fake listings. They won't. They will not remove them. I actually submitted photographic evidence of an authentic pair of that specific style Louboutins against the fake on the listing, and they still did not remove the listing. So a couple of additional tips. Number one, don't purchase the shoes if you can't verify the style name. This is really important. You should be able at some point to figure out the style of the shoe, and if you can't, that means it's a good chance that it's fake, so I would not even risk it. The second tip is do not purchase from sellers who are either unwilling to send you additional photos of those areas that you need to authenticate the shoe, or two, if they won't respond to your questions at all. The photos is the most important because if you can't 100% authenticate that shoe, there's no point in buying it. And if the seller is serious about selling the shoe, they should be willing to give you additional photos, period. Likewise, if you have a question about the shoe, like you want to know the width or the insole length or something like that, the seller should be able to tell you that. If they physically have the shoe there, they should take the extra 2 minutes to measure it for you or answer whatever questions you have. If the seller is unwilling to even communicate with you, you're probably going to have issues, whether it's them taking a month to ship them, or maybe they misrepresented the condition of the shoe. Maybe the shoe they're saying is brand new and it ends up being worn. I've actually had that happen to me. For me personally, I will not purchase from a seller who is just unwilling or doesn't care enough to communicate with me. And that would be my recommendation to all of you. Another tip, and it's more of just something you need to note, is that if you're shopping on Poshmark specifically, if the shoes sell for $500 or more, they will automatically get rerouted to a Poshmark authentication center to be reviewed before they ship them to the buyer. This is something to note because if the seller knows they're selling fakes, there's a good chance that they are willing to accept a lower price than $500 so they don't have to risk that the authentication center identifies them as fakes. So just keep that in mind if you're getting red flags already with the listing or the seller, and then it's either listed under $400 or if it's close to $500, like $550, $600. Listings never go for full value on Poshmark, so you know that they're actually expecting to sell the shoe for under $500, so they miss that mark. On the flip side, I personally do not trust Poshmark's authentication center. I've heard very bad horror stories about them authenticating ones that were fake and then deeming ones that were authentic fake, and there's not much you can do about that. So if you buy a pair of shoes and the authentication center deems them authentic, still check out the shoes when you get them. Take a good look before you start wearing them around, just to make sure that they actually are authentic, because it happens. It definitely happens. The last tip is just to make sure that everything adds up. For example, if the shoes are a brand new style, but then you notice that the box is one of those really old styles, that's kind of a red flag. Why are they trying to sell this new shoe with an older style box? Or like I said before, if the shoes look brand new and they haven't been worn, but yet you can tell that the heel taps have been replaced, that's a red flag too. So just look for those things. Anything that doesn't add up should be a red flag for you. I always say the devil is in the details, and it's those little details like that that can help you identify a fake within seconds. So we're going to get personal now, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience buying the pair of fakes. These fakes were extremely well done. They were one of the closest fakes I've ever seen. At the time I purchased them, I knew nothing about Louboutins. I did have one pair, but my husband bought it for me a week prior, and I'd only worn it a few times around the house, so I really had no experience with Louboutins. On top of that, there was no extensive guide like this to help me out. With that said, even though these shoes were one of the best fakes that I've ever seen, I was still able to identify that they were fake. And so I think this is going to give you a little more confidence that you can do it too. Even though they were so well done, there were 10 red flags that I missed. The first red flag was that I couldn't figure out the style of the shoe, and it didn't even come with a box. Normally when there's a box, at least you can see the style name, you can look that up and see if it matches up to the shoe. But that was the first red flag, is I couldn't narrow down the style. It kind of looked like a Fifile, maybe a Mercy Allen, maybe a Dolly, something along those lines. But every time I compared it to photos of those styles, there was always something that was off. Maybe the curve of the heel wasn't exactly right, or maybe the toe box was just a little bit different. There's always something that didn't add up, so I knew it wasn't one of those styles. And that should have been a red flag to me right off the bat, and that's something that you can determine before you even buy the shoes. You don't need them in person, you can tell by the photos online. The other thing was that these were supposed to be older worn shoes, but they looked brand stinking new. When I got the shoes in person, I realized that this red part right here looked like it was freshly painted. It was almost too vivid, too bold. And that should not be the case if the shoe is really old. It should not look freshly painted. And then number 3, of course, is that they had been resold. So that took away my ability to authenticate them by the wear on the red bottoms. At the time, I thought the signature on the red bottoms looked legit. It was super close. One of the closest fake signatures I've ever seen. But afterwards, when I was looking at photos of the red bottoms from the listing, and then I was looking at photos of authentic Louboutins, I realized that the L was off. The L did have a point, and it did almost touch itself on the back, but the point was not pointed enough. It was a little bit off when you're looking at the current style signatures. And this was not a Vero Cuoio stamped Louboutin, so there's no reason why it shouldn't match one of those signatures. Then when I looked at it, the thickness was off. It just didn't flow correctly, the thin to thick, thin to thick. It was just off. And so it never got as thin as it should or as thick, and it was kind of off in the places where it got thick to thin. Now at the time, of course, I didn't know that. It looked close enough to me. There's really no way I would have known. It's just now, after doing all this research for a year and building the class, that I realized that the signature was in fact off. Also, the stitching was wrong. Of course, again, I didn't know at the time what Louboutin stitching looked like, but it was missing that double stitch in the back of the heel, so that wasn't there. And like we said, 99% of Louboutin pumps have that double stitch. There's only a few styles that don't. And then it also didn't have the vertical half stitch, which is not a deal breaker, but it's still a red flag. When I got the shoes in person, these shoes were almost too glossy, a really fake, cheap, crappy looking shine. And it was kind of ripply too. When you looked up close, you could see it was very, very ripply around the whole shoe, so they weren't smooth. And then when I tried on the shoes, one of the heel taps actually disintegrated. Literally just fell apart. This should not happen. It's possible if you've been wearing them around a lot and they're older, but these shoes look like they hadn't been worn. right? It didn't make any sense, and I literally just put them on and the shoe top disintegrated. So that was a red flag as well. And then the 9th red flag was that when I tried on the shoes, I couldn't feel the hug. And what I mean by the hug is that Louboutin leather is such high quality that it almost feels like it's hugging your feet. It's different than being tight. It's not just tight. It literally feels like it's hugging your feet, especially when you try them on and you wear them for 10 to 20 minutes and they kind of warm up and begin to mold to your feet. Because eventually you're going to break them in and they're going to fit like a glove on your feet. And I couldn't feel that sensation with these shoes. They definitely felt tight, but they didn't feel like they were hugging my feet. Just think of that when you try them on. Are they just tight? Or does it feel more like they're actually hugging your feet and kind of holding them? The other thing that told me that they were fake was when I initially tried on the shoe, they actually almost felt too tight. Like I almost couldn't even get my feet into them. It was really, really hard. So I wore them around for a few minutes and all of a sudden I realized that they weren't tight anymore. In fact, not only were they not tight, they were too big, where I was almost falling out of the shoe. They were almost completely unwearable. There is no way you should go from having a shoe that you can't even jam your foot into to 5 minutes later having to be so loose that you're falling out of it. This part right here in particular, I noticed it was starting to do this. Like the leather was starting to come up and wasn't holding its shape like it's supposed to. And that right there is when I took them off and I initiated the return. The fact that I couldn't feel the hug when I tried on the shoes, and then the fact that these shoes could not even hold their own shape or form, told me that this was definitely not Louboutin leather, period. There was no doubt in my mind. Alright guys, you are officially experts at authenticating your own Louboutins. Don't forget, if you need help in the future, you can always download the Louboutin Legit Check guide in the description, or you can head on over to Reddit and ask for help in our Louboutin Legit Check community. Happy hunting for your dream pair of red bottoms!